It had been quite some time I posted some content on YouTube or Twitter or um, Facebook, video recordings, I mean, and there is a good reason for that, and most importantly, um, the fact that some of the things in my life and around my life, shall we say, are nearing their climax. And I find it frightening how accurate most of intuitions, feelings, predictions I had and I shared were. Of course, I'm aware of confirmation bias, and by no means, not even deep down, as any psychologist would immediately jump on the opportunity just to dish out what they meant to be fighting against shame. So just to dish out the ultimate blame and shame, because after all this self-improvement, over-focused, so-called positive psychology is about shaming and blaming the individual for everything. Personally, I think that's at least as bad and paralyzing than any overpowering shame would be. Most importantly, um, I don't know how much more time, repetition, uncertainty, damage, opportunities, or even freedom needed for people to kind of pause and think. There is a reason our species is called Homo sapiens, the thinking human. So let's think and pause and think and consider the following. Do not fight shame. Do not think that just because, for instance, Americans, US of A, I mean, North Americans speak English, although with a different accent mostly, do not even think for a moment they actually understand the very same words, the very same way as, for instance, somebody from England would do. The context, the culture, so the time is um, different. There's an individual relationship to it, the individual experience beyond the shared experience, the shared meaning. So once for all, what if we pause and think and realize, do not throw away shame? I mean, let's, just face the situation why people seem to be holding on to shame so much now when we know how paralyzing that could be to us, and the two big um, internal comments, shall we say, but oftentimes external also, or in many shapes or forms, could be external as well. The two tapes, as Brain Brown, the now world famous researcher from Texas, identified this. At least she was the first one from whom I heard about this back in around 2010-ish. So, how does that shame works? Plays two tapes. One of them is "Who do you think you are?" and the other one is "Not being enough, not good enough, not whatever enough." So not enough. Um, Yet people seem to be holding on to it quite strongly and severely, and oftentimes, although most of the time unspoken, consciously. What if shame is a shield? What if shame is a bridge to maintain connection, or bridge the gap between the values we share, and oftentimes we even advertise, shall we say, aspirational values or real values, between that one and the actual lived experience of culture in any relating or community. That could be relating to my own self, how much I lie to myself, for instance, and for what purpose, and in a family, in a romantic relationship, at a workplace, in a subculture, say LGBT communities, in a charitable organization, amongst members of a profession, for instance, nursing or healthcare profession, or even indeed in a region or in a distinct ethnic group or even an entire country. So do not eliminate anything, because nobody are stupid entirely, meaning they won't throw away shame just to make themselves utterly vulnerable and exposed without anything and start to learn the dynamics, the power dynamics of relating within themselves and through the network they are existing in. For a variety of reasons, it appears to me that, and I mentioned this before a number of times, this observation, humanity had been through a developmental curve, and it's the nature of things, it's still happening. Evolution, evolving, is not like just kind of we're looking back after a million years and we realize we evolved. No, it's occurring at the very same time when we are contemporaries, and that's the ultimate uncertainty in our lives. So there is enough uncertainty, I believe, to sort out and cope with and relate to throughout life, and make decisions when there is no guarantee that, regardless of our intention, eventually the meaning of every single decision we made, every single step we took or avoided, what that would be, regardless of our intention. And it feels right now, definitely in my own life, that very little control I have over letting people know, or letting the outside world know, what were my intentions and what other plausible, equally valid explanations can potentially and do exist for anything that happens beyond just the one, which is usually blame or shame based. Even though that's my own life, and I do find now these days it's very prominent to me, but it's just my experience, it may not be the truth, or the entire fabric of truth, that meaning seems to be predominantly created afterwards, and often, or most often, by others. Yet, that meaning has an impact on the individual's life, which means when they have no say in it, when they have no control over it, yet the actual meaning created to their actions or omissions by most often others have a profound impact on their life for a significant amount of time, day in, day out, afterwards, impacting, influencing how they live, what's their life experience, how their relations pan out. And so therefore there is a ripple effect on, so not just an impact on them, but a ripple effect on all the individuals who are within their network to some extent, a variable extent. That means the lack of freedom, because they're not in control anymore. We can live in fear, as many people do, because of a variety of reasons. Particularly islanders have this tendency here in the UK particularly. But that does not mean whatever they experience is invalid or even necessarily narrow-minded. It is a well-known fact that when people act on fear, adrenaline runs around. They have a sort of tunnel vision. Their bandwidth of thinking or their frame of mind is narrower. But that does not necessarily mean that narrower frame of mind is less than, say, anybody else's who are interacting with them and are on dopamine, so cooperating, curious, courageous, and want to improve things, make that extra mile. The person on the dopamine may have a much wider um, bandwidth, but the two does not necessarily entirely overlap. So the narrower mind frame does not necessarily lie within that wider mind frame. And that little difference that may be is important. Leadership management is like exerting control over things and taking responsibility more often than not unconsciously, for things like culture and history we have no control over. So that's quite silly most of the time, to be honest, and if not incompetent. Leadership is like dancing. Quick step is one of the dances. I often use as an example in my clinical work, or used to use when I was a clinician, when I was a nurse, as 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 an example for the patients. When we are talking about their addressing their concerns and fears and queries regarding recovery after major surgery, for instance. And I often said to them, do not expect anything linear. It's like a quick step. Steps goes slow, slow, quick, quick, slow. Sometimes quicker, sometimes slower. But there is something else more important with this. Development, even evolution, adaptation, isn't linear. For a start, resilience most of the time means halting time for a good reason. To survive, recover, and to be enough to adapt. Because resilience means bouncing back to the state where we were before the major stressor, external, internal, whatever, happened to us. Means pausing time. If we keep repeating being resilient all the time, we will never adapt. So we violate the power of time. The new revelation to me was one person in a certain culture at a certain time, certain circumstances, in a certain context, can have so much power over the other that the other person may have no other choice just to grin and bear it. And that's exactly what happened to me. And that's exactly why I feel that I lost my sense of humor, or even my ability to live. Probably I could exist and be um, bitter, but is it worth it? Why do I say this? Because this morning I witnessed a small family arriving to Vauxhall or St George's Pier. I was down at the pier at the riverside sipping my morning coffee. And the daughter, so it's husband, wife, another relative, probably the brother of the husband in their early 30s, mid 30s, and the daughter around 4 or 5 year old. So they're arriving to the pier, and the pier is similar to any river piers, similar to the ones in Budapest, which means it's not fixed structure. Most importantly, because River Thames has very high tide waves, so like I don't know, 5-6 meters at least, every single day. So it has to move around, obviously, when the tide comes and ebbs away. So they're arriving on this structure, in this metal structure which floats on the top of the river, and to which the river boat service, Thames Clippers, it's called, the boat, usually um, stops at, so the passengers can get on and get off. And so they arrive on the pier, and the little daughter, of course, comments on everything. It's new to her, apparently. And she says, "Oh, this is the boat." And the dad then says, "Oh, no, 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 this is the pier. It's called the pier." And I could see. I look at the daughter at this point. I'm sitting nearby on the actual deck of the pier, and I can look at the daughter at this point, and she's baffled. And I realize we are on the water, so there is river everywhere. I can see, basically. And because of the weather, it's kind of hazy, so it's like the air and the water on the horizon kind of muddles together, so you cannot distinct really. Apart from the buildings you can see on the shore, but you cannot really distinct where the water ends on the horizon and where the air starts. And what you can see, she's obviously feeling that thing is floating, she's on. And I was thinking for a moment how right she was. She was non-judgmental. Why? Because it's really a question of viewpoint, or how do I relate to things, whether I consider the moor to be floating, and the river flowing away, or the other way around. What if the river is actually stationary and we are flowing or flying or swimming along together to the pier itself? This is all relative. And I remember just a few years ago, it was a kind of almost revolutionary development in science, modern science, when the way we look at the behavior of fluids, gases, air, water have changed dramatically ever since someone came up with the idea, I don't know how, I don't know that bit, that everyone can swim because the air around us behaves like, therefore should be considered, and would be better understood if regarded to be fluid. It is indeed. That brings me to an important question I have. When I was in intensive care up until 2015, and when I retired from it, and I was a clinical supervisor, I was teaching a lot, informally, formally both. And one of the things people liked the most, including not only nursing students but even medical students, was mechanical ventilation, breathing machines. And one of my questions was usually, bedside teaching was the thing I loved. So the patient was there presented with the case and the problem, just play along and think loudly. Of course, with the necessary authorizations and requests, patients, environment, people in place. And one of my questions was, okay, so now we ventilate the patient, and we've got a certain percentage of oxygen going in the air mixture, but what is the most abundant gas in air? So we are talking about people who are at university, medical students in their fourth or fifth year, I believe, or nursing students at least in their third year. And what really baffled me was that nobody could immediately answer my question. And oftentimes they went with things like oxygen and stuff. It's nitrogen. 74, depending on the textbook, 74-75% of the air mixture we have is actually nitrogen. But we don't measure it in critical care, or most of the time otherwise when it comes to human health or humans' resilience or adaptation, intensive care. Because it's inert. It does not do anything, so to speak, or not anything we measure or we understand yet to the human body. Therefore, we don't measure it. We take it as a constant, as something that is there, but it's not the most important right now. to us. At least that's what we think. This is where we are with our scientific development. That also brings me to another point. So oftentimes the most abundant thing is the most invisible. As the English say, hiding in the plain sight. It's really important. I mean, you human beings tend to think along categories, but I'm getting a bit cautious about mentioning any kind of categories or any kind of models of thinking. The way I see things, the way I kind of try to organize events or manage, understand, and deal with complexity, because these categories are not rigid by any means. These are models of thinking, models of understanding, and as with any models, it is important to remember models are models. Models are aids to help us to understand complexity or manage it, but by no means the full story, by no means the full experience, and oftentimes that little extra means a lot. My favorite one is the two sides of the coin metaphor often used, which I think it's really good one, because if you have a coin, I don't have any on me, so I can't demonstrate it. If you have a coin, you've got the tail and the head, the two sides, but these days particularly, it seems to me, the most important is the third side of the coin, that little in between that connects the tail and the head, without which neither the tail nor the head have any meaning or, in fact, any value. That connection between the two is crucial. So let's pause and think. Let's, before we judge, just try to be at least fair. Spending a lifetime with blame and shame does not make anyone expert in it. Just because it's familiar, it's oftentimes just a conditioning, like a Pavlovian reflex. We learned it through conditioning. It does not make it helpful and useful at all times. It's like communicating, requires practice. But even when we're practicing, when we need to be a bit more mature about it and tread carefully. Because if you just go like with full force, out of self-entitlement or self-improvement, what have you, regardless of the label, or regardless of the idea, regardless of the motivation behind of it, oftentimes we tread on things we don't even recognize or realize, boundaries of others, or even worse, dreams of others. So next time, when there is a small child at the pier, it would be so great to witness just once if the parent or whoever would not respond immediately saying, "Oh, this is not the boat, this is the pier." Just tell them something different, like, "Oh, you're right, it feels like being on the boat because it seems as the water is stationary and we swim away. However, there's another side of the story. Let's do not pass on. Do not teach children just one way of relating. Because if we do, then we persist the problems, although possibly in different packaging. History does not repeat itself. If there is a sense of it's happening, then we did not do something right. Homo hominis hominem, and we are not against each other by default. I think there is now plenty of evidence, and my own life right now tells me, although in the indirect domain, although in the invisible domain, there is a reason why there is widespread perception of Englishmen being a gentleman. And I did not understand this for a very long time. Trying to find the words, because I'm end of a certain part of a journey, and it did not go in a way I wanted it. So have a lovely Saturday. This is 22nd of April 2023. I'm sending my thoughts from Vauxhall Park in central London. Have a nice weekend.